So let us carry on with our conversation, or with my monologue rather, about inequality in the United States. And I have a couple more slides that basically illustrate the same thing. Gotta make this point. So the image here on the left, you have, this one is about income. You remember income is what is generated from wealth. And you have a decline, and make sure I'm understanding this. So you have the top 1% versus the bottom 50%. The blue line here, let's see, the blue line here is the top 1%. So gradually what we've seen since 1970s up till 2000 and something 15 here, we've seen the top 1% earn more and more money. And what we see here, so remember this represents 1% of Americans, and this line represents 50% of Americans. This is the bottom 50th percent. So we've seen the poor, or the bottom half, we've seen a gradual decline. So this gap between, right here, between how much the wealthy make and how much everybody else makes is just getting more and more. Over here, we have a chart. This one goes back to 1988 up until 2018. And each one of these lines represents groups, racial and ethnic groups. So that's a whole nother topic. That's a whole nother chapter to talk about race and ethnicity. We'll start talking about it now. And you see at the bottom, the group that, now we've seen a gradual increase, kind of up and down with all the groups, but Black folk are at the bottom and white people are fairly close up here at the top, or the second line. And then the very top is Asian Americans, and Asian Americans are routinely referred to as the model minority. And lo and behold, when we get to the chapter on race, we're going to see this pattern over and over and over again. With Black folk at the bottom and Asian Americans above them, at the top. So here you've got another way of illustrating the same thing. In this case, they have taken wealth and broke it down into not quartiles, thirds. I don't know what that one would be called. So you have the top third, the bottom third, and then the middle third. And you see that the bottom third has gone from, in the 80s, they were earning 7%. And by 2016, they're only earning 4% of all wages. The middle third was doing this. So when you hear people talk about the declining middle class, this is what they're talking about. They're talking about how the middle class used to be more in the middle. Even the poor class used to be closer to the middle class. And the middle class were earning 32%. Now they're down to 17%. So the middle class are not as relatively well off. The poor have gotten poorer. The middle class is more likely to be poor. And in the meantime, you have the top third was earning about 60%, and now they're earning close to 80%. So the rich are getting richer, and everyone else is getting poorer. Over here, you have CEO's pay is up since 1978. And what's significant about 1978 is coming out of the Great Society, President Johnson, out of the late 60s, we started to see some reduction in inequality. Things like public housing, you had affordable housing, public housing programs, Head Start. You had all kinds of social welfare programs. And in the 80s, Ronald Reagan's administration started dismantling them, and Bill Clinton's administration continued to dismantling them. So we have fewer social safety net programs in the United States than we had in the 70s, because gradually administrations have cut them. So when sociologists look at these trends and look at how the inequality's gotten worse in the 80s and into the 90s, they are sensitive to the fact that social policies changed, and that poor people, or the inequality was declining when we had social safety nets. And now when the social safety nets go away, inequality gets worse. You know, the fact that things like the minimum wage hasn't kept up with inflation, things like that. So Here you have the dark line, that's CEO's pay, and the typical worker is down here. So the idea, again, is that in the 80s and the early 90s, they were closer, and that gap has just gotten more and more. Look at this, we got more of the same. I wonder what point Sarah's trying to make. So here you've got the CEO worker, and then how many workers. I thought that was a little video, pay in 30 seconds. I don't actually know what that means, what that one's about. And then I threw this little chart in. You can find lots of charts like this. The income inequality varies by region, by geographic place, by state, even sometimes within states. There's some variation. And so what you see on this map is the blues are the ones that have the less inequality, and where there's less of a gap between the rich and the poor. And the red states are the states where there is more of a gap between the rich and the poor. And what that usually means is because the red states are also states that are characterized by really more poverty, like there's more poor people. That's not absolutely true, but that is the general pattern. So southern states, Mississippi, there's a greater gap between the rich and the poor. And some of these patterns, I mean, you can leave it to yourself to, make observations about the politics of those regions as well. Okay, so now that was about property, right? That was about property. Now I want to talk about another element of social class, and that is power. Power, by definition, refers to people's ability to make someone do something they wouldn't do. I think your textbook says the ability to get your way despite resistance. In other words, when you can make somebody do something they don't want. We live in a culture that is characterized by what sociologists and others call the Democratic Facade. And the Democratic Facade is the idea that we are all of us are participants in the decision-making process by voting, that we vote for the elected officials who then take our needs and considerations and wishes into consideration before they vote. Sociologists, specifically, I forget the fellow from C. Wright Mills, says this is just a facade. We want to believe this is true, but in fact, yeah, it's C. Wright Mills right here. He argued that no, that's not how it is. This is what they want us to believe, but in fact, the decisions are made by this group that they call a power elite. And you probably heard me talk about the power elite before. But the power elite, and here's kind of a shape of it, or not the best picture I could find, but it's the idea that there are a handful of very powerful people, and they're making decisions they're not really about us. They're not really considering, the masses of people, but they're making decisions that are in their best interest. That they're an elite group of folk who interact with each other at the golf course and professionally and in social circles. And it's sort of like the idea that they're so socially removed from the masses. They can't really even relate to everybody else. But they're making decisions. This term is not used in your textbook, but an example of the power elite that you may or may not have ever heard about is something called the military-industrial complex. And the military-industrial complex is an example of a power elite, powerful decision-making people in the military, in corporations, in the government, and they make decisions. They make like security decisions, going to war kind of decisions that is mutually beneficial to all of them. So, for instance, CEOs or stockholders of airplane manufacturing plants would say, well, it would benefit my economic interests if we, flew some planes into a war zone, because then I could build more planes and I can sell them to the government. And maybe a military person would say, and I could advance my career. So it's kind of like You know, it's kind of like in any organization, and some sociologists have argued you can take this idea of a power elite and you can really see it in any significant organization where, you know, you have, say, faculty meetings and they sit down and they, yes, they're considering their students, but they're also considering what is in their own individual best interest, and they make big decisions about that's going to affect a whole lot of people. So they have power and they're an elite group of folks. Not everybody gets invited to those meetings to have a say, but it's going to affect them, right? The idea of a power elite. I hope that makes a little bit of sense. Another element of social class that's discussed and that's highlighted in this chapter is prestige. And prestige is a attitude. So the idea is that your relative social class rank predicts or is predicted by the respect or regard that other people give you. There once upon this was made, I think, in the 1970s, not this particular chart, but there was a concept or there was an idea um, conceptualized in the 1970s called occupational prestige. And in fact, I think there might be just mentioned it. I think it is actually in your textbook. And in fact, there was international use of these surveys, and they went all over the world, and they had people rank jobs based on their occupational prestige, right? And they found that there were patterns, and this is one, I couldn't find the date on this one, but this one is a fairly new one. But you can see, you know, people at the top have a relative score of what you've got. Physicians and lawyers have a relative prestige score of 86, dentists 74, psychologists 69, high school teachers at 66. So physicians have higher prestige than high school teachers, is what they're saying. And what these researchers observed was that the jobs that scored higher on this prestige, I mean, retail workers not on here, it'd be way down at the bottom. But what the jobs higher at the list had in common is they had higher pay, they required more education, the jobs themselves required more abstract thought and more autonomy. In other words, they could make more of their own decisions. A professor requires more education, makes more money, and really kind of has way more control over what they do than a high school teacher does, right? So consequently, those are higher prestige jobs. What's interesting is how consistently from one generation to another generation, these relative rankings, and even internationally, the relative rankings stay the same, right? So that's what we mean by prestige. Your textbook talks about what are called the markers of prestige. So sometimes we'll sort people out, we'll separate them based on like the colors they wear. Like priests, that was an example they used in their textbook. I was thinking of graduation ceremonies and the hats, right? The different shaped gown that you wear. Do you have, like my gown? I actually have the little velvet stripes because I have a FUD, a PhD, right? Those are markings of prestige. The example, there's a mention of how the president is always the last one to walk in the room because it signifies that he's not going to wait on anybody, that everybody waits on him. In royalty, you never turn your back to the king and the queen. That's seen as disrespectful. I hope you can hear me. There's noise outside my office. And then another example certainly would be for young people, and I suppose even some not so young people, labels on their clothes, you know, what kind of names they have on their purse, right? All of those are symbols of prestige. Status comes with, or status is sort of the byproduct of your prestige, right? Your relative rank in a social group. A couple really, I think, interesting concepts about status consistency. So the idea is that we can hold, it's not at all uncommon for people to hold multiple statuses. And so you might be high on one element of your social life or low on it. So I'll just explain status inconsistency first. Inconsistency. So an example of status inconsistency would be professors. They look at this chart. I mean, they're fairly high up here. They're better paid than high school teachers, but they're really not very well paid, like compared to CEOs or, I mean, salespeople. salesmen, car salesmen, make more than some college professors do. So, and as your textbook talks about, there's some of the highest, most educated people in the United States. So they have a fairly high rank. Like, I can't get any more letters after my name in my sociological background. I have to, like, you just can't, right? So they're a very high rank on one, but in terms of their income, they're very low rank. And this is what we mean by status inconsistent. If, on the other hand, you had a very high rank on one and you had a very high wage, that would be status consistent. What is interesting is that people that are inconsistent, that have a very high status in one and a very low in the other, are also likely to be fairly radical in terms of their political views. And I appreciate, the textbook attempts to explain like the political position of faculty. And this is true. I remember this when I was at a when I was working at a 4-year school too. It was even true across campuses, because over in the social sciences and the gender studies, those are some of the lowest wage faculty members. Not all professors make the same amount of money. Over in the business, those were some of the highest paid faculty members. The faculty in the business were more likely to hold more traditional, conservative, less radical. The faculty in the sociology department were way more likely to be radical, right? Because they both had very high education, but one was making way more money. I mean, like significantly more money than the other. So I hope that makes some sense what we mean by status. And I'm going to wrap this one up right here.